Between March 19, 1847 and September 14, 1853, 14 altar boys vanished without a trace from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in rural Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. Not one body was ever recovered. Not one credible witness came forward. The church records from those 6 years were destroyed in a fire that mysteriously left every other document in the rectory untouched. What makes this case truly chilling isn't just the number of missing children, but the pattern that emerges when you examine the dates, the circumstances, and the systematic way evidence was eliminated. 3 weeks ago, renovation work at the old Sacred Heart Municipal Building uncovered a lead-lined box buried beneath the foundation. Inside were 127 pages of handwritten testimony, sealed church correspondence, and photographs that the Diocese of Pittsburgh had ordered destroyed in 1854. These documents reveal that the disappearances weren't random tragedies or runaways seeking adventure. They were part of something far more calculated, something that transformed a house of God into a hunting ground and turned the community's most trusted figure into their greatest threat. The survivors who broke their 170-year silence describe rituals disguised as prayer, children who returned from private sessions fundamentally changed, and a pattern of psychological manipulation so sophisticated that parents willingly delivered their sons into the hands of a predator. Tonight, you'll hear the complete account that church authorities buried, witness testimony that was sealed under threat of excommunication, and evidence that suggests the horrors at St. Joseph's may have been just one link in a chain of similar incidents spanning decades. Before we descend into the darkness that consumed Sacred Heart, this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the monsters that hide behind the faces we trust most. If you're ready to join our brotherhood of mystery hunters who dare to uncover the truth that powerful institutions spend fortunes to bury, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what state you're listening from. Few channels have the courage to reveal the stories we're about to explore, and this one will test even the strongest nerves. What happened at St. Joseph's begins with the arrival of a man whose charm was matched only by his hunger, and whose faith was as deep as the graves he would eventually fill. The hills of western Pennsylvania in 1845 were a patchwork of hope and desperation, where Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine built new lives from the rocky soil and their unshakable faith. Sacred Heart wasn't even a proper town, just a collection of wooden houses clustered around St. Joseph's Catholic Church like children seeking shelter from a storm. The church itself stood on a slight rise overlooking Mill Creek, its grey fieldstone walls and simple bell tower visible for miles across the rolling countryside. The community of 312 souls had scraped together every penny to build their sanctuary, hauling stones from nearby quarries and cutting timber from the surrounding forests. They weren't wealthy. Most men worked the dangerous coal mines that honeyed the hillsides, while others found employment in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, a grueling 2-day journey on horseback. But they were devout, carrying their Catholic faith like armor against the Protestant hostility they faced in their new homeland. When Father Cornelius O'Malley arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday in October 1845, he seemed like an answer to their prayers. At 38, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made strong men lower their eyes and mothers instinctively trust him with their children. Standing 6 feet tall with prematurely silver hair and piercing blue eyes, O'Malley spoke with the educated accent of Dublin's seminary, but understood the struggles of working-class immigrants. He had served parishes in Boston and Baltimore, he told them, and carried letters of recommendation from bishops whose names commanded respect throughout Catholic America. The previous priest, elderly Father McKenna, had died suddenly the month before, found collapsed in his garden with no apparent cause, his face peaceful as if he'd simply chosen to step from life into eternity. The parish had been without spiritual guidance for weeks, their requests for a replacement seemingly lost in the bureaucratic maze of the Philadelphia diocese. O'Malley's arrival felt providential, especially when he produced documents bearing the seal of Bishop Francis Kenrick himself, authorizing his assignment to St. Joseph's. Within weeks, O'Malley had transformed the spiritual life of Sacred Heart. His sermons drew families from neighboring settlements, his Latin pronunciation was flawless, and his knowledge of Catholic doctrine seemed encyclopedic. He established a proper altar boy program, something the elderly McKenna had never managed, and began training young men in the sacred rituals that would prepare them for lives of Christian service. Parents competed to have their sons selected for this honor, seeing it as a pathway to education and advancement that their own poverty had denied them. The church reflected their collective devotion and O'Malley's refined sensibilities. He commissioned new stained glass windows depicting the Irish saints, Brigid, Columba, and Patrick, whose stories resonated with their immigrant experience. The altar was adorned with brass candlesticks purchased with money raised through church socials and donated labor. Most impressive was the bell tower, which O'Malley had enhanced with a clock mechanism and a bronze bell that chimed the hours, calling the faithful to prayer with a voice that seemed to echo from heaven itself. But it was in his relationship with the altar boys that O'Malley truly excelled, or so it seemed to the grateful parents who watched their sons flourish under his guidance. Michael Flanagan, the baker's boy who had struggled with reading, suddenly began reciting Latin with fluid precision. Tommy Sullivan, barely 10 years old, spoke of theological concepts that impressed visiting priests. Patrick Donnelly, the blacksmith's eldest son, announced his intention to pursue the priesthood, inspired by O'Malley's example of scholarly dedication and spiritual authority. The boys served not just during Sunday Mass, but at weekday services that O'Malley instituted for the spiritual benefit of the community. They learned to tend the altar candles, prepare the communion wine, and assist with the complex rituals that marked the Catholic calendar. O'Malley explained that this training required special sessions in the church's basement, where sacred relics were stored and where the boys could practice without the distractions of a full congregation. Parents noticed changes in their sons, a new seriousness, a deeper spirituality, an almost adult understanding of religious matters. The boys spoke less about childhood games and more about their calling to serve God. They formed close bonds with each other and with Father O'Malley, creating what seemed like a spiritual brotherhood that elevated them above the mundane concerns of secular life. Mary Sullivan, Tommy's mother, was particularly proud of her son's transformation. The boy who had once spent hours chasing frogs in Mill Creek now spoke earnestly about the mysteries of the Eucharist and the importance of absolute obedience to God's representatives on earth. When she asked about his private lessons with Father O'Malley, Tommy's eyes would take on a distant look as he spoke about sacred secrets and special prayers that he couldn't share with anyone outside the brotherhood of altar boys. What none of them understood, what none of them could have imagined, was that their beloved priest was carefully selecting and grooming his victims, using their faith as a weapon against them and their children's devotion as a trap that would eventually consume 14 young lives. The man they trusted with their souls was methodically preparing for a harvest that would begin on the feast of St. Joseph, just as winter finally released its grip on the Pennsylvania hills. The morning of March 19th, 1847, dawned clear and cold, with frost still glittering on the windows of Sacred Heart's modest homes. The Feast of St. Joseph was one of the most important celebrations in the Catholic calendar, and St. Joseph's Church prepared for a day of special masses, communal meals, and the kind of joyful fellowship that strengthened the bonds of their immigrant community. The bell tower chimed the dawn call to prayer, as it had every morning for the past year and a half. But this would be the last time its bronze voice would sound without carrying an undertone of tragedy. Michael Flanagan, at 12 years old, was the most experienced of Father O'Malley's altar boys and had been chosen for the honor of assisting with the special dawn mass that would begin the feast day celebrations. His mother, Brigid, had pressed his white surplice until it gleamed like fresh snow, and watched from the kitchen window as he walked the familiar path to the church. His prayer book clutched against his chest, and his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She expected him home within 2 hours for the breakfast of soda bread and bacon that she prepared every feast day morning. When those 2 hours stretched to 3, then 4, Bridget felt the first stirrings of unease. Michael was punctual to a fault, a boy who had never been late for a meal or missed his chores without explanation. She walked to the church, expecting to find him helping Father O'Malley with preparations for the noon mass, but found the building empty except for Mrs. Catherine Morrison, who was arranging flowers on the altar. Father O'Malley left hours ago, Catherine explained, adjusting a spray of early spring daffodils. Right after the dawn service ended. He said he had business in Pittsburgh and wouldn't return until evening. I assumed Michael went home with you. The search began immediately and involved every family in Sacred Heart. Men who should have been celebrating the feast day instead combed the surrounding forests, calling Michael's name until their voices echoed off the limestone cliffs that bordered Mill Creek. They dragged the deeper pools where a boy might have fallen through thin ice, searched the abandoned mine shafts that dotted the hillsides, and questioned every traveler on the roads leading to Pittsburgh and Johnstown. Father O'Malley returned as the sun was setting, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grave with concern. He had indeed traveled to Pittsburgh, he explained, to meet with Bishop Kenrick about expanding the altar boy program to include boys from neighboring parishes. The bishop had been so impressed with the spiritual development of Sacred Heart's young men that he wanted to use their program as a model for rural churches throughout western Pennsylvania. When told of Michael's disappearance, O'Malley's reaction seemed entirely appropriate for a priest who had lost one of his most devoted altar boys. He immediately organized additional search parties, led prayers for Michael's safe return, and spent hours counseling the boy's distraught parents. But when the searches continued for 3 days without finding any trace of the missing child, O'Malley called the community together for a meeting that would establish the pattern for everything that followed. The gathering took place in the church on a Thursday evening, with nearly every adult in Sacred Heart packed into the simple pews. O'Malley stood before them in his black cassock, his silver hair catching the light from dozens of votive candles, his voice carrying the weight of spiritual authority as he addressed their fears and confusion. "My dear brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, his Dublin accent lending gravity to every word. "We are gathered in sorrow and bewilderment, seeking answers that may test our faith in ways we never imagined. Young Michael Flanagan has vanished from our midst, and despite our most diligent efforts, we have found no trace of him in the physical world. But I must share with you what Michael confessed to me during our last private conversation, a burden that I can no longer bear alone." The congregation leaned forward, desperate for any explanation that might make sense of their tragedy. O'Malley's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing them to strain to hear every word. "Michael came to me 3 days before the feast, tormented by guilt over a sin so grave that he feared for his very soul. He had been stealing communion wine from the sacristy, not just small tastes, but entire bottles that he shared with boys from the Protestant settlements. Worse, he had been mocking our sacred rituals, teaching these heretics to perform blasphemous parodies of the Mass for their amusement." Gasps echoed through the church. Michael's parents, sitting in the front pew, looked stricken. Their son had always been devout, never showing any sign of the rebellious spirit that sometimes afflicted boys his age. "I counseled him, of course," O'Malley continued, explaining that while his sins were serious, God's mercy was infinite for those who truly repented. "We prayed together, and I gave him a special penance. He was to spend the entire night of the feast day vigil in the church, praying for forgiveness and strength to resist further temptation. When I left for Pittsburgh that morning, Michael was supposed to remain in prayer until my return." The priest's voice broke slightly, as if overcome by emotion. "I believe that in his shame and fear, young Michael chose to flee rather than face the community he felt he had betrayed. He may have sought out those Protestant boys who led him astray, or perhaps he has run off to the cities where anonymity might provide escape from his guilt. We must pray that he finds his way back to us and to God's grace." It was a masterful performance, creating a narrative that explained Michael's disappearance while simultaneously discouraging too much investigation. Who would want to pursue a boy who had committed such sacrilege? What parent would want their own child associated with such blasphemy? The community accepted O'Malley's explanation because the alternative, that their priest might be lying, that something sinister had occurred in their own church, was simply unthinkable. But Margaret O'Brien, who cleaned the church twice weekly and knew every stone of its construction, had noticed details that gnawed at her consciousness like hungry rats. When she arrived to prepare for the feast day mass, she found Michael's prayer book abandoned on the sacristy floor, its leather cover stained with something dark that didn't look like spilled wine. The altar candles had burned down to stubs, their wax pooled in patterns that suggested they had been moved and rearranged multiple times during the night. Most disturbing of all, the door to the church basement, which Father McKenna had always kept locked, claiming the space was too dangerous for regular use, stood slightly ajar. Margaret had descended those stone steps only once before, years ago, when Father McKenna needed help retrieving Christmas decorations stored in the basement. She remembered a simple stone chamber with rough walls and a dirt floor, used for storage and nothing more. But the smell that drifted up from the basement that morning was different. Incense mixed with something organic and decay-sweet that made her stomach clench with nausea. When she mentioned these observations to Father O'Malley, his reaction was swift and severe. His blue eyes turned cold as winter ice, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. "Margaret," he said, his tone gentle but unmistakably threatening, "I understand that grief and confusion can lead good people to imagine things that aren't there. The human mind, when faced with tragedy, often creates explanations to fill the void left by uncertainty. But spreading unfounded speculation about sacred spaces and holy rituals is not just unwise, it's sinful. The church basement contains relics and religious artifacts that require special handling. If you detected unusual odors, they likely came from the incense used to bless these sacred objects." He stepped closer, and Margaret found herself backing against the pew, intimidated by his towering presence and the certainty in his voice. "I would hate to see you carry the spiritual burden of bearing false witness against your priest and your church. Perhaps it would be best if you focused on your cleaning duties and left theological matters to those of us trained to understand them. Gossip is the devil's tool, Margaret, and I would not want to see you become his unwitting servant." The rebuke stung worse than a physical slap, and Margaret learned to keep her concerns locked away like dangerous secrets. But she continued to clean the church, and she continued to notice things that didn't align with Father O'Malley's explanations. She began keeping a journal, writing down observations that seemed insignificant individually, but formed a disturbing pattern when viewed together. The search for Michael Flanagan officially ended after 1 week, though his parents continued to hope for his return for months afterward. Father O'Malley established a memorial fund in the boy's name, using donations to purchase new religious texts for the Altar Boy program and expand the training facilities in the church basement. Life in Sacred Heart slowly returned to its normal rhythm of work and worship. But beneath the surface, seeds of doubt had been planted that would eventually grow into a harvest of terror. What none of them realized was that Michael Flanagan had never left St. Joseph's Church. His body lay in a specially prepared chamber beneath the basement floor, along with evidence of rituals that would have shattered their faith and sanity if they had discovered them. And Father O'Malley was already selecting his next victim from among the remaining altar boys whose parents would deliver them willingly into his hands, trusting in his wisdom and never imagining that their most sacred beliefs were being used as weapons against their own children. The months following Michael Flanagan's disappearance brought subtle but persistent changes to St. Joseph's Church that the congregation attributed to their shared grief and Father O'Malley's determination to prevent similar tragedies. The priest's sermons grew darker and more complex, dwelling on themes of hidden sin, divine punishment, and the absolute necessity of obedience to God's appointed representatives on earth. He spoke often of the spiritual warfare being waged for the souls of their children, of unseen enemies who would use any weakness or doubt to corrupt the innocent. "The devil is cunning," O'Malley would intone from the pulpit, his voice carrying to every corner of the stone church, and he particularly targets those who serve at God's altar. Our altar boys face temptations that ordinary children cannot imagine, spiritual attacks designed to turn their devotion into rebellion, their purity into corruption. This is why they require special protection, special training, and special prayers that can only be performed in sacred spaces blessed for such purposes. The Altar Boy program continued, but with new protocols that O'Malley explained as necessary precautions learned from Michael's tragic fall from grace. Boys would now serve individual sessions with the priest rather than training in groups, allowing for more personalized spiritual instruction. These sessions often took place in the church basement, which O'Malley had been gradually renovating and sanctifying for advanced religious education. Parents noticed changes in their sons who participated in the program, but these changes seemed entirely positive. Tommy Sullivan, now 11, and the most senior altar boy after Michael's disappearance, displayed a spiritual maturity that impressed visiting priests and made his mother weep with pride. He spoke knowledgeably about theological concepts that most adults struggled to understand, quoted Latin scripture with perfect pronunciation, and demonstrated a level of devotion that seemed almost mystical. But Kathleen Murphy, whose 13-year-old son Danny had recently joined the altar boys, began to observe details that troubled her maternal instincts. Danny had always been a cheerful, talkative child who shared every detail of his day at the dinner table. After beginning his private sessions with Father O'Malley, however, he became increasingly quiet and withdrawn, answering questions about his training with vague responses about sacred mysteries and special prayers that he couldn't discuss with anyone outside the altar boy brotherhood. More disturbing were the physical changes she noticed. Danny began losing weight despite eating normally, dark circles appeared under his eyes as if he wasn't sleeping well, and his hands developed a subtle tremor that became more pronounced whenever Father O'Malley's name was mentioned. When she asked about these symptoms, Danny would insist he felt fine, but his voice carried a hollow quality that reminded her of sleepwalkers she had seen in her childhood in County Cork. The boy also began displaying knowledge and behaviors that seemed inappropriate for his age and upbringing. He knew details about Catholic history that weren't taught in their simple parish school, spoke casually about religious practices from other cultures, and sometimes used Latin phrases that Father O'Malley claimed were advanced prayers taught only to the most spiritually mature altar boys. When Kathleen asked where he had learned such things, Danny would simply say that Father O'Malley was teaching them about the true church that existed before modern corruptions watered down the faith. Most unsettling of all were the nightmares that began afflicting Danny within weeks of his first private session. He would wake screaming about the dark place under the church and the man in shadows who wasn't really Father O'Malley. When pressed for details, Danny could only describe fragments. Stone chambers lit by candles that burned with different-colored flames, voices chanting in languages that hurt to hear, and rituals that left him feeling empty inside, like something important had been taken away. Kathleen's concerns deepened when she noticed that other altar boy families were experiencing similar changes in their sons. Young Timothy Walsh had developed a stutter that appeared only when discussing his church duties. Brian O'Connor, previously an energetic boy who loved outdoor games, now spent hours sitting motionless in their family's small garden, staring at nothing with the vacant expression of someone far older than his 12 years. Most disturbing was Patrick Donnelly, the blacksmith's son, who had once spoken enthusiastically about following Father O'Malley into the priesthood, but now flinched whenever the priest's name was mentioned. When Kathleen attempted to discuss these observations with other mothers, she encountered resistance that puzzled and frustrated her. These were women who had shared every detail of their children's lives since birth, but suddenly they seemed reluctant to acknowledge any problems with the altar boy program. Some claimed their sons were simply maturing spiritually and shouldn't be questioned about sacred matters. Others suggested that Kathleen was being overprotective and should trust Father O'Malley's judgment about what was best for the boys. Behind this reluctance lay a complex web of shame, denial, and social pressure that Father O'Malley had carefully cultivated. He had explained to parents that their sons were being trained in advanced spiritual disciplines that required absolute secrecy to maintain their sacred power. Any discussion of these training methods with outsiders would not only invalidate the boys' spiritual progress, but could expose them to demonic influence. Parents who truly loved their children, he suggested, would respect these boundaries and trust in the wisdom of the Church. Moreover, O'Malley had skillfully positioned criticism of the altar boy program as criticism of the Catholic faith itself. In a community where religious identity was their primary defense against Protestant hostility and economic marginalization, questioning the priest's methods felt dangerously close to apostasy. Parents who harbored doubts found themselves caught between their protective instincts and their need to belong to the only institution that offered them dignity and community in their new homeland. The second disappearance occurred exactly 1 year after Michael's vanishing, on the feast of St. Joseph, 1848. Tommy Sullivan failed to return from what Father O'Malley described as a special overnight vigil for the souls of the departed, a ceremony that the priest claimed was practiced in the most ancient Christian communities and required the participation of only the most spiritually advanced altar boys. This time, O'Malley's explanation was more elaborate and harder to verify. Tommy, he announced with great ceremony during Sunday Mass, had been selected for an extraordinary honor. Bishop Kenrick himself had requested the boy for a special mission to the Western Territories, where his spiritual gifts were desperately needed to establish new parishes among the growing Catholic communities in Ohio and Indiana. The boy had been sworn to secrecy about his destination to protect him from those who might oppose Catholic expansion into Protestant-dominated regions. The priest produced official-looking documents bearing elaborate seals and signatures, written in the formal language that impressed Sacred Heart's largely illiterate population. He read aloud excerpts praising Tommy's exceptional spiritual development and natural gifts for advanced religious instruction. The boy's parents, Mary and Patrick Sullivan, were told they should feel honored that their son had been chosen for such important work, even though it meant they might not see him again for years. But Margaret O'Brien, still cleaning the church despite her growing unease, had noticed the same disturbing signs that preceded Michael's disappearance. The basement door had been left ajar on the morning Tommy vanished, and the smell of incense mixed with something organic and corrupt had been stronger than ever. She had also observed Father O'Malley's behavior during the weeks leading up to the feast day, noting how he had paid special attention to Tommy during services, keeping the boy after other altar boys were dismissed, and speaking to him in whispers that seemed to entrance the child. More troubling was her discovery, while cleaning the sacristy the day after Tommy's supposed departure, of the boy's most prized possession, a small wooden cross that his grandfather had carved in Ireland and given to him before dying of fever during their Atlantic crossing. Tommy had worn that cross every day since arriving in America, claiming it protected him from harm and connected him to his Irish heritage. Margaret couldn't imagine the boy willingly leaving it behind, regardless of what honor awaited him in the Western Territories. When she mentioned this discovery to Father O'Malley, his reaction was swift and more threatening than before. He explained that Tommy had deliberately left the cross as a spiritual anchor that would help him maintain his connection to Sacred Heart while serving in distant lands. Any suggestion that the boy hadn't departed willingly was not just wrong, but dangerous. It could undermine the important work being done by the Church and expose the community to persecution by Protestant authorities who opposed Catholic expansion. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of menace that made her skin crawl, "I'm beginning to wonder if your continued questions about matters beyond your understanding represent a spiritual problem that requires attention. Perhaps you should consider confessing these doubts and receiving proper guidance about the sin of bearing false witness against God's work." The threat was clear, and Margaret understood that pursuing her concerns further could result in her being branded as a troublemaker, or worse, having her own faith questioned in a community where religious orthodoxy was essential for social survival. She fell silent, But she continued to watch and document the disturbing patterns that surrounded Father O'Malley's ministry. As 1848 turned to 1849, the priest's influence over Sacred Heart continued to grow. He established new traditions and rituals that he claimed were based on ancient Catholic practices recently approved by the Vatican. These included special midnight masses attended only by altar boys, extended fasting periods that were supposed to enhance spiritual sensitivity, and private confession sessions that could last for hours and left the boys appearing drained and disoriented. The community accepted these innovations because they seemed to produce visible results. The altar boys displayed unprecedented knowledge of Catholic doctrine, demonstrated remarkable devotion during services, and spoke with an adult sophistication about spiritual matters that impressed visitors from other parishes. Several bishops had praised Sacred Heart as a model of rural Catholic education, and there was talk of expanding their methods to churches throughout the region. What none of them understood was that they were witnessing the systematic psychological and spiritual destruction of their children, orchestrated by a predator who had learned to use their deepest beliefs as weapons against them. Father O'Malley wasn't just selecting victims. He was grooming an entire community to deliver those victims willingly, using their faith to blind them to warning signs and their trust to silence their protective instincts. The darkness that had claimed Michael Flanagan and Tommy Sullivan was spreading through Sacred Heart like an infection. And the worst was yet to come. By the winter of 1850, 5 altar boys had vanished from St. Joseph's Church, and even the most faithful parishioners could no longer ignore the pattern that was emerging like a stain spreading through clean cloth. Father O'Malley's explanations had become increasingly elaborate. Boys sent to prestigious seminaries in distant cities, special missions to convert Protestant communities, even claims that the missing children had been blessed with mystical visions calling them to hermetic lives of prayer and solitude, in monastery retreats that maintained strict rules about contact with the outside world. Each disappearance followed the same disturbing sequence: weeks of intensive private sessions with the priest, visible changes in the boy's behavior and physical condition, and finally, a special ceremony or vigil from which the child never returned. The explanations always involved some great honor or divine calling that required absolute secrecy and immediate departure. Parents were presented with official documents, told of the extraordinary spiritual gifts their sons possessed, and reminded that questioning God's plans was both prideful and potentially damaging to their children's sacred missions. But cracks were beginning to show in Father O'Malley's carefully constructed narrative, visible to those brave enough to look beyond the comfortable lies that allowed the community to function. Sean O'Connor, whose 13-year-old son Liam had disappeared the previous autumn during what the priest called advanced mystical training, had begun drinking heavily at Murphy's Tavern in nearby Millfield. The normally reserved coal miner would sit alone at the bar, nursing whiskey and muttering fragmentary statements that chilled anyone who overheard them. "The sounds at midnight," O'Connor would whisper, his eyes unfocused and his hands shaking. "Not prayers. Something else. Latin, but wrong somehow. Words that make your teeth ache when you hear them." He spoke of walking past the church late at night and seeing lights moving in the basement windows, shadows that didn't match the number of people who should have been inside. Children's voices, but singing songs no Christian child should know. Songs that sound like they're coming from underground, from deeper than any basement should go. Mary Gallagher, who lived closest to the church and suffered from insomnia that kept her awake during the small hours, had made similar observations. She claimed to have seen figures in white robes moving through the cemetery on moonless nights, carrying bundles toward the old mausoleum that housed the remains of Sacred Heart's founding families. The figures moved wrong, she insisted, with jerky motions like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. And they seemed to glide rather than walk across the uneven ground. Most disturbing of all was her account of the sounds that sometimes drifted from the church during these midnight processions. Children crying, she told her sister in hushed tones, but not like hurt children, like lost children, calling for their mothers from some place far away. And underneath it all, That voice. Father O'Malley's voice, but deeper than it should be, speaking words that made me close my shutters and pray until dawn. These fragmentary reports might have been dismissed as the fantasies of grief-stricken parents and sleep-deprived neighbors, but they began to form a pattern when compared with observations from other sources. James McKenna, nephew of the church's previous priest, had been going through his uncle's papers and discovered a journal that cast new light on Father O'Malley's arrival in Sacred Heart. According to the journal, Father McKenna had grown increasingly suspicious of his replacement during the weeks before his death. The old priest had received a letter from Bishop Kenrick's office announcing O'Malley's assignment, but when he wrote to confirm the appointment, his inquiries went unanswered. More troubling were the references O'Malley made to theological concepts that seemed to combine Catholic doctrine with elements from much older traditions, practices that McKenna couldn't find in any approved church texts. The journal's final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, described McKenna's growing fear that something was fundamentally wrong with his replacement. O'Malley had requested access to the church basement and seemed particularly interested in the building's history, asking detailed questions about the stone used in its construction and whether any significant burials had taken place on the property before the church was built. When McKenna had mentioned that the site was rumored to have been a meeting place for German settlers who practiced some form of folk Christianity before the Irish arrival, O'Malley's reaction had been one of intense interest rather than the dismissal such superstitions should have received from an educated priest. "There is something ancient stirring beneath our sacred ground," the journal's final entry read, "something that has been waiting for the right hand to awaken it. I fear I have been too weak to prevent what is coming, and I pray that God will forgive my failure to protect the innocent from the wolf I have allowed into our fold." Father McKenna had died that night, found peacefully in his garden the next morning with no apparent cause of death, and his face bearing an expression that witnesses described as one of profound resignation rather than peace. The breaking point came in March 1851, exactly 4 years after Michael Flanagan's disappearance, when Patrick Donnelly, now 16 and the oldest of the remaining altar boys, approached his father with a story that would shatter the fragile facade of normalcy that Sacred Heart had maintained for so long. Patrick had always been intelligent and perceptive, qualities that had initially made him Father O'Malley's favorite altar boy. But those same qualities had eventually allowed him to see through the priest's carefully constructed deceptions and recognize the true nature of what was happening in the basement of St. Joseph's Church. What he revealed to his father that night, speaking in whispers behind the locked door of their cottage, painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as religious instruction and predatory behavior, masked as spiritual guidance. The private sessions, Patrick explained, had begun normally enough with additional training in Latin pronunciation and instruction in the more complex aspects of Catholic ritual. But gradually, Father O'Malley had introduced elements that seemed to come from sources outside traditional Catholic practice. The boys were taught ancient prayers in languages that predated Latin, shown symbols that the priest claimed represented the true cross used by the earliest Christian communities, and instructed in breathing techniques that were supposed to enhance their spiritual sensitivity. These sessions took place in chambers beneath the church basement that Patrick swore hadn't existed during Father McKenna's time. The rooms were carved from living rock and decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if the human eye wasn't designed to process such geometry. Candles burned with flames that cast shadows in the wrong directions, and the air was thick with incense that smelled of flowers and decay in equal measure. Most horrifying of all, Patrick claimed that the missing boys weren't gone. They were still in the church, changed by what Father O'Malley called the true communion. He had seen them during the midnight ceremonies, their eyes reflecting light like animals, and their movements controlled by will other than their own. They spoke in voices that sounded like multiple people talking in unison, and they served the priest in ways that made Patrick violently ill when he tried to describe them. "They're not dead," he whispered to his father, his face pale as candle wax and his hands shaking with remembered terror. But they're not alive either, not in any way that matters. Father O'Malley calls them his eternal altar boys, and he says that someday all of us will join them in service that never ends. He's been preparing me, Da. Special lessons about accepting transformation and embracing the sacred hunger. He says I'm almost ready. James Donnelly, a man whose faith had sustained him through the horrors of the potato famine and the challenges of building a new life in America, found himself facing a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. To believe his son meant accepting that their beloved priest was something monstrous, that their church had become a hunting ground, and that the faith they had used to define their identity was being weaponized against their own children. To dismiss Patrick's account meant potentially sacrificing his eldest son to whatever evil had already claimed 5 other boys. The decision he made would divide the community of Sacred Heart and set in motion events that would expose the truth about Father Cornelius O'Malley and reveal that the horrors hidden beneath St. Joseph's Church were far worse than even Patrick's nightmares had suggested. The confrontation that would tear Sacred Heart apart began not with violence or accusation, but with 3 fathers sitting around James Donnelly's kitchen table on a cold February night in 1851, sharing whiskey and gathering courage for what they all knew might be the most dangerous decision of their lives. Sean O'Connor sat hunched over his glass, his coal-stained hands trembling slightly as he spoke about the sounds that haunted his nights. Michael Walsh, whose boy Timothy had developed that persistent stutter after joining the altar boys, stared into the fire and shared observations that had been eating at his conscience for months. And James himself revealed his son Patrick's terrifying account of what really happened during those private sessions in the church basement. They were not reckless men or natural rebels. These were immigrants who had learned to keep their heads down and avoid confronting authority. Men who understood that challenging the wrong person could mean losing their jobs, their homes, and their place in the only community that would accept them. But they were also fathers, and the protective instinct that had driven them across an ocean to build new lives for their families was now screaming that their children were in mortal danger. "We can't go to the sheriff," O'Connor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Protestant lawmen won't listen to Catholic concerns, and even if he did, what proof do we have? Strange sounds in the night, children having nightmares, a priest who's maybe too friendly with the boys. They'd laugh us out of the county courthouse, and we'd be marked as troublemakers." Walsh nodded grimly. "And we can't write to the bishop either. O'Malley's got documents with Kenrick's seal, letters of recommendation that look official enough. If we accuse him of whatever this is, without proof, they'll transfer us to another parish or worse, could lose our jobs, our homes, whole community could be scattered." James Donnelly took a long pull from his whiskey glass and felt the burn in his throat match the fire of determination building in his chest. "Then we get proof," he said simply. "We find out what's really happening in that basement, and we document it. Whatever O'Malley is doing to our boys, we expose it." The plan they devised was simple, but terrifying in its implications. They would conduct surveillance of the church during the nights when Patrick reported that the special ceremonies took place, gathering evidence of any inappropriate activities. If they found proof of abuse or misconduct, they would present it to church authorities in Pittsburgh, along with testimony from their sons. If they found nothing, they would accept that their fears were unfounded and submit to whatever consequences their suspicions had earned them. But as they made their preparations over the following weeks, collecting oil lamps, checking the loading of Sean's old hunting rifle, and coordinating their schedules to ensure all 3 could participate, they began to uncover additional evidence that their worst fears might not be paranoid delusions after all. Timothy Walsh's medical condition, for instance, proved to be more serious than a simple childhood stutter. The family doctor, an elderly German immigrant named Klaus Brennan, who served the scattered Catholic communities throughout the region, had examined the boy and found symptoms that puzzled his considerable experience. Timothy's reflexes were abnormally slow, his pupils often dilated even in bright light, and his body temperature ran consistently lower than normal, conditions that Dr. Brennan associated with certain types of poisoning or prolonged exposure to toxic substances. More disturbing were the scars that the doctor discovered during his examination. Small, precise cuts on Timothy's arms and chest that formed patterns too regular to be accidental injuries. When questioned about these marks, the boy claimed they were sacred symbols that Father O'Malley had carved during blessing ceremonies to protect him from demonic influence. The cuts were healing cleanly and showed no signs of infection, suggesting they had been made with sterilized instruments by someone with medical knowledge. Patrick Donnelly's condition was even more alarming. His father had noticed that the boy often seemed to be listening to voices that no one else could hear, turning his head toward empty spaces and responding to questions that hadn't been asked. When pressed about this behavior, Patrick explained that Father O'Malley had taught him to hear the voices of the saints, who provided guidance for those spiritually advanced enough to receive their communications. But the voices weren't always benevolent, Patrick admitted during one of his more lucid moments. Sometimes they whispered about the hunger that lives beneath and the price that must be paid for true communion. They told him about the other altar boys, describing where they had gone and what they had become in service to something that the voices called the Ancient Shepherd, a being that predated Christ, but had learned to wear Christian symbols like a wolf wearing sheep's clothing. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Sacred Heart intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the nightmare that consumed St. Joseph's Church. The night of March 15th, 1851, 4 days before the anniversary of Michael Flanagan's disappearance, the three fathers positioned themselves in the woods surrounding St. Joseph's Church, armed with weapons, witnesses, and a terrible determination to learn the truth about what had been happening to their children. What they discovered in the hours that followed would challenge everything they thought they knew about good and evil, faith and corruption, and the lengths to which a predator would go to satisfy hungers that normal human beings couldn't even imagine. Sean O'Connor took position behind the mausoleum in the church cemetery, where he could observe the main entrance and any movement between the church and the surrounding buildings. Michael Walsh concealed himself near the bell tower, with a clear view of the basement windows that Patrick claimed were sometimes illuminated during the midnight ceremonies. James Donnelly, carrying his son's detailed description of the basement layout, planned to approach the church directly and attempt to observe whatever activities might be taking place in the chambers below. The first 3 hours passed in silence, with only the normal sounds of a rural night and the distant howling of wolves in the surrounding forest. The men began to wonder if their fears had been groundless, if they were chasing shadows created by grief and suspicion, rather than confronting a real threat to their children. But at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, lights appeared in the basement windows of St. Joseph's Church, and the sounds that drifted across the cemetery made their blood run cold. It began as chanting, but not in any Latin that their years of Catholic worship had taught them to recognize. The words seemed to twist in the air, creating harmonics that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. Underneath the vocal sounds was a rhythmic beating, like a drum, but with an organic quality that suggested something other than animal hide was being struck. And threading through it all was a high, sweet sound that took them several minutes to identify as children's voices, singing in perfect unison words that no Christian child should know. Michael Walsh, positioned closest to the basement windows, reported later that the lights visible through the glass weren't the steady glow of oil lamps or candles, but flickering illumination that changed color as he watched. Sometimes the warm yellow of normal flame, sometimes the cold blue-white of winter lightning, and occasionally a deep red that reminded him of blood viewed through colored glass. But it was James Donnelly who witnessed the most disturbing events of that night. Approaching the church from the side where Patrick had shown him a basement entrance that was usually locked, he found the door standing slightly ajar and warm air flowing from the opening despite the February cold. The smells that emerged from that portal were a mixture of incense, burning wax, and something organic that reminded him of the charnel house, where pigs were slaughtered during the autumn harvest. Gathering his courage, James descended the stone steps that led into the basement of St. Joseph's Church, following the sounds and lights toward chambers that shouldn't have existed according to the building's original plans. What he saw in the depths beneath their place of worship would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life, and challenge every assumption he had ever made about the nature of evil and the vulnerability of innocence. The basement had been transformed into something that belonged more in the pagan temples of ancient Rome than in a 19th-century Catholic church. The walls were covered with symbols carved deep into the stone, designs that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering candlelight as if they were alive. Candles burned in arrangements that formed geometric patterns too complex for accidental placement, their flames casting shadows that moved independently of the objects that should have created them. At the center of the largest chamber stood an altar made from a single piece of black stone, its surface polished to mirror smoothness and stained with substances that James preferred not to identify. Around this altar, moving in a slow circle that followed the rhythm of the drumming, were 7 figures in white robes. But these weren't the simple surplices worn by altar boys during normal church services. These garments were decorated with the same twisted symbols that covered the walls, embroidered in threads that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the faces beneath those hoods that broke something fundamental in James Donnelly's understanding of reality. 5 of the 7 figures were the missing altar boys: Michael Flanagan, Tommy Sullivan, and the others who had supposedly been sent to distant seminaries or missionary postings. But they had been changed in ways that went beyond simple physical alteration. Their eyes reflected light, like those of nocturnal animals. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, as if controlled by a single mind, and when they opened their mouths to continue the chanting, the sounds that emerged seemed to come from multiple throats, speaking in unison. The 6th figure was his own son, Patrick, moving with the same mechanical precision as the others, but still recognizably himself, evidence that whatever transformation process was being used hadn't been completed yet. And leading the procession, his silver hair gleaming in the unnatural light and his blue eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed far older than his apparent age, was Father Cornelius O'Malley. But the priest James had known for over 5 years was gone, replaced by something wearing his form like an ill-fitting garment. The man conducting this obscene ceremony moved with fluid grace that seemed to defy the normal limitations of human anatomy, spoke in voices that layered upon themselves to create harmonies no single throat could produce, and radiated an authority that felt like a physical presence pressing down on everything in the chamber. As James watched in paralyzed horror, the ceremony reached some kind of crescendo. O'Malley raised his hands above the black altar, speaking words in a language that predated Latin by centuries, and the changed altar boys began to sing in voices that seemed to come from underground, from depths that extended far beyond the basement of any church. The sound was beautiful and terrible simultaneously, a choir of innocence corrupted and transformed into something that served hungers too ancient and alien for human comprehension. The moment was broken when James, overcome by the magnitude of what he was witnessing, stumbled backward and knocked over a ceremonial candle. The sound echoed through the stone chamber like a gunshot, and 7 pairs of eyes turned toward his hiding place with predatory focus. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, James Donnelly stared into the faces of children he had known since birth, and saw nothing recognizable looking back at him. Then Father O'Malley spoke a single word in that ancient language, and the transformed altar boys began moving toward James with movements that flowed like water but struck the stone floor with sounds like breaking bone. James turned and ran, his survival instincts overriding the protective urges that had brought him to this place, and behind him he could hear the pursuit. Not footsteps, but something that scraped and whispered across the basement floor like wind through a graveyard. He reached the outside air just as Sean O'Connor and Michael Walsh came running from their own positions. their faces pale with terror and their voices babbling about things they had seen moving in the cemetery that shouldn't exist in a world governed by natural law. The three men fled into the forest without speaking, running until their lungs burned and their legs gave out. And only when the sun began to rise did they dare to stop and try to make sense of what they had witnessed. The confrontation that would expose the truth about Father Cornelius O'Malley began 3 days later, when Bishop Francis Kenrick arrived in Sacred Heart with a retinue of church investigators and a wagon full of documents that would shatter everything the community thought they knew about their beloved priest. The bishop's visit wasn't a response to the father's reports. None of them had found the courage to approach church authorities with accounts that sounded like the ravings of madmen. Instead, Kenrick had come in response to inquiries from other parishes about missing altar boys and disturbing reports from communities where O'Malley had previously served. The investigation that followed would reveal that the man who had claimed the identity of Father Cornelius O'Malley was responsible for disappearances spanning nearly 2 decades and covering hundreds of miles. The real Cornelius O'Malley had indeed died in a seminary fire in Dublin in 1832. But his identity had been assumed by someone whose true name appeared in no official records, and whose history stretched back through a series of assumed identities to origins that church investigators could never definitively establish. Bishop Kenrick, a man whose ecclesiastical career had included dealing with some of the Catholic Church's darkest secrets, had begun tracking the pattern after receiving reports from parishes in Boston, Baltimore, and Philadelphia about altar boys who had vanished during periods when their congregations were served by visiting priests bearing impeccable credentials and impressive letters of recommendation. The report shared disturbing similarities. Boys who disappeared during religious ceremonies, communities that were reluctant to investigate too deeply, and priests who moved on to new assignments before questions could be raised. What made the case particularly troubling was the sophistication of the deception involved. The false documents weren't crude forgeries, but masterful recreations that required access to official seals, detailed knowledge of church hierarchy, and connections that suggested the impostor had inside information about Catholic administration. Moreover, the theological knowledge displayed by the false priest was genuine and extensive, indicating someone who had received legitimate religious education before turning to darker purposes. The confrontation at St. Joseph's Church took place on March 19, 1851. Exactly 4 years after Michael Flanagan's disappearance, and during what church records would later reveal was planned to be the completion of O'Malley's Great Working, a ceremony that would have given him permanent control over Sacred Heart and its population. Bishop Kenrick, accompanied by 2 other priests and armed with both ecclesiastical authority and legal warrants, arrived at the church during what they expected to be normal morning services. What they found instead was a community in the grip of something that went beyond simple religious devotion. The congregation sat in perfect silence, their faces bearing the same vacant expression that James Donnelly had noticed in his son Patrick. Father O'Malley conducted the service with theatrical precision, but the Latin words he spoke weren't from any approved Catholic liturgy. The responses from the congregation came in unison, as if the entire community had been rehearsing the same script, and their voices carried harmonics that made the visiting bishops feel physically ill. But it was the altar boys who provided the most damning evidence of what had been happening at St. Joseph's. 7 children served the false priest with mechanical precision, their movements perfectly synchronized, and their faces bearing expressions of rapturous devotion that no human child should possess. When Bishop Kenrick called for them to approach so he could speak with them privately, they moved as a unit, turning their heads toward him with predatory focus that reminded him of wolves evaluating prey. The boys spoke in unison when questioned, their voices layering to create harmonies that shouldn't be possible from individual human throats. They claimed to be happy in their service, blessed to have been chosen for special duties that brought them closer to God than ordinary children could ever hope to achieve. But their words were too perfect, their responses too rehearsed, and their eyes reflected light in ways that suggested something fundamental had been altered in their biology. When Bishop Kenrick demanded to inspect the church basement, O'Malley's carefully maintained facade finally cracked. The man who had spent years projecting an image of scholarly piety and humble service suddenly radiated an authority that felt ancient and hostile. His blue eyes turned black as winter nights, his voice dropped to registers that seemed to come from underground, and he spoke words in languages that predated Christianity by millennia. "You have no authority here," O'Malley declared, his form seeming to grow larger and more imposing despite not actually changing height. "This ground was consecrated to powers older than your carpenter god, blessed by rituals that your church stole and corrupted for its own weak purposes. These children belong to me by right of conquest, and I will not surrender them to priests too frightened to embrace the true nature of divine hunger." The battle that followed lasted only minutes but felt like hours to the witnesses who survived to describe it. O'Malley revealed abilities that no human being should possess, speaking in multiple voices simultaneously and moving with speed that left afterimages in the air. The altar boys formed a protective circle around him, their synchronized movements creating patterns that hurt to watch directly and generated sounds that shattered several windows in the church. But Bishop Kenrick had come prepared for more than just a theological dispute. The documents he carried included not only evidence of O'Malley's false identity, but also detailed instructions for dealing with entities that had learned to wear human form while serving inhuman purposes. The ritual he performed wasn't an exorcism in the traditional sense, but something older and more specific. A binding that would force the creature to abandon its stolen identity and reveal its true nature. The result was horrifying beyond anything the witnesses had imagined possible. O'Malley's human appearance began to deteriorate like a mask melting in fire, revealing something underneath that belonged to no classification of life that natural science recognized. His skin became translucent, showing dark veins that pulsed with rhythm too fast for a human heart. His eyes multiplied, opening at his temples and the back of his neck, like windows into spaces that shouldn't exist. And his voice, when he screamed his rage at being exposed, shattered every piece of glass in the church and drove 3 of the investigating priests to their knees, with hands pressed over their bleeding ears. But the most devastating moment came when the binding ritual reached its climax, and the spell that had transformed the altar boys was broken. The 7 children collapsed simultaneously, their bodies convulsing as whatever had been controlling them was forcibly expelled. When they finally stopped moving and opened their eyes, 5 of them stared at the ceiling with the vacant gaze of the truly dead, while 2, including Patrick Donnelly, began screaming with voices that sounded like children again for the first time in months. The thing that had called itself Father Cornelius O'Malley made one final attempt to maintain its hold over Sacred Heart, speaking words that tried to reimpose the mental dominance it had exercised over the community for years. But its power had been broken by the exposure of its true nature, and instead of compliance, it faced a congregation that was finally seeing clearly after years of spiritual manipulation. James Donnelly, freed from the supernatural influence that had kept him passive despite his growing suspicions, grabbed his son Patrick and ran from the church, followed by other parents who suddenly understood what had been done to their children. Behind them, the creature's screams of rage and frustration echoed across the Pennsylvania hills like the sound of damnation itself being denied its promised harvest. The official church records of what happened at St. Joseph's Church on March 19, 1851, was sealed by order of the Vatican and wouldn't be opened for examination until 1998, when changing attitudes toward institutional transparency forced the Catholic hierarchy to acknowledge some of its darkest secrets. The documents revealed that the case of the false Father O'Malley was part of a pattern that church investigators had been tracking for decades. Entities of unknown origin that had learned to infiltrate religious communities by assuming the identities of legitimate clergy. Bishop Kenrick's final report, written in the careful language of ecclesiastical diplomacy, described the perpetrator as a malevolent intelligence of non-human origin that had developed sophisticated methods for exploiting the trust and faith of isolated Catholic communities. The report noted that the entity had demonstrated abilities that defied natural law, including apparent immortality, shape-shifting capabilities, and the power to exert psychological control over large groups of people for extended periods. But the most disturbing aspect of the case wasn't the supernatural elements. It was the systematic way the creature had used the Catholic Church's own structure and beliefs to facilitate its predation. By assuming clerical authority, it had gained access to children whose parents would never question a priest's intentions. By invoking religious obedience, it had silenced potential victims and their families. And by operating within an institution that valued faith over skepticism, it had created an environment where warning signs were interpreted as tests of devotion rather than calls for investigation. The 5 altar boys who died during the binding ritual were given Catholic burial in Sacred Heart Cemetery, but their families were told they had succumbed to a virulent fever that had swept through the region. The truth about their prolonged torment and the circumstances of their deaths was deemed too traumatic for public consumption and too damaging to the Church's reputation among immigrant communities who depended on religious institutions for social cohesion and spiritual comfort. Patrick Donnelly survived, but the boy who returned to his father's house bore little resemblance to the cheerful child who had once dreamed of becoming a priest. The months of psychological manipulation and supernatural influence had left him with permanent neurological damage that manifested as seizures, memory gaps, and episodes of catatonic withdrawal that could last for days. He never spoke about what had happened during his time as an altar boy, but he would wake screaming from nightmares that involved underground chambers and voices that called his name from empty spaces. Timothy Walsh, the other survivor, recovered more completely, but was left with a severe stutter that made normal conversation difficult and a persistent tremor in his hands that prevented him from pursuing his family's trade as a blacksmith. He eventually became a hermit, living alone in a cabin deep in the Pennsylvania forests and avoiding human contact except for monthly trips to town for supplies. Local residents reported that he could sometimes be heard talking to himself during these visits, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there and answering questions in voices that didn't sound like his own. The community of Sacred Heart never recovered from the trauma of discovering that their spiritual leader had been a predator in disguise. Families scattered to other settlements throughout western Pennsylvania, carrying their shame and silence to new churches where they learned to speak of their time at St. Joseph's as a period of spiritual confusion that was best forgotten. The church building itself was deconsecrated and sold to the county government, which converted it into a storage facility for road maintenance equipment and sealed the basement with concrete to prevent unauthorized access. But sealing the basement couldn't contain the psychological contamination that had spread through Sacred Heart during O'Malley's tenure. Several families reported continuing supernatural phenomena in their new homes. Children who spoke in languages they had never learned, household objects that moved without explanation, and voices that whispered from empty rooms during the darkest hours of the night. Dr. Klaus Brennan, the physician who had examined Timothy Walsh, documented cases of what he termed residual spiritual influence, affecting multiple members of the Sacred Heart diaspora, symptoms that persisted for years after their escape from the false priest's control. The creature that had assumed Father O'Malley's identity was never captured or definitively destroyed. Bishop Kenrick's binding ritual had forced it to abandon its human disguise and flee from Sacred Heart, but church investigators found evidence suggesting it had simply moved to a new location and begun the process of assuming another clerical identity. Reports from parishes throughout the Midwest described visiting priests whose credentials seemed impeccable, but whose methods raised subtle questions among observant parishioners. In 1867, 16 years after the Sacred Heart incident, a similar pattern of altar boy disappearances was reported from a German Catholic community in Wisconsin. The investigating priest found evidence of basement chambers that shouldn't have existed according to architectural records, ritual symbols carved into church walls, and testimony from survivors describing ceremonies that combined Christian liturgy with practices that belonged to much older traditions. But by the time church authorities arrived to investigate, the priest responsible had vanished, leaving behind only empty chambers and the traumatized remnants of another shattered community. The final chapter in the St. Joseph's case wasn't written until 1923, when the old church building was finally demolished to make way for a new county courthouse. Workers discovered that the basement extended far deeper than the original building plans indicated, with chambers carved from living rock that showed signs of recent occupation despite being sealed for over 70 years. The walls were covered with symbols that matched those described in Bishop Kenrick's report, but they appeared to have been carved recently rather than during the 1850s. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of personal items belonging to children who had gone missing from surrounding communities during the previous decade. Items arranged in ritual patterns around stone altars stained with substances that resisted chemical analysis. The workers also reported finding 14 sets of small bones buried beneath the basement floor, arranged in geometric patterns around a central chamber that showed evidence of repeated ceremonial use. The bones were given Christian burial in Sacred Heart's new cemetery, but the workers who handled them reported experiencing nightmares for months afterward. Dreams of children singing Latin hymns in voices that echoed from underground chambers and shadows that moved independently of the objects that cast them. Several of the construction crew quit their jobs rather than continue working on the courthouse project, claiming they could hear whispers coming from the excavation site during night shifts. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a forensic anthropologist who examined the remains at the request of local authorities, determined that the bones belonged to children aged between 8 and 16 who had died over a period spanning several decades. The most recent remains showed evidence of death occurring within the previous 5 years, suggesting that whatever had happened at St. Joseph's in the 1850s had continued long after the church was supposedly sealed and abandoned. Her report, filed with both civil authorities and the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh, included a recommendation that the entire courthouse site be consecrated by appropriate religious officials before construction continued. The recommendation was quietly ignored, but workers on the project reported continuing supernatural incidents. Tools that moved overnight, foundation concrete that cracked in patterns that resembled the ritual symbols found in the basement, and the persistent sound of children's voices singing during the early morning hours when the construction site should have been empty. The courthouse was completed in 1924 and served the county government for nearly 8 decades, but employees reported a higher than average rate of psychological problems, mysterious illnesses, and job turnover throughout its operational history. The building was finally abandoned in 2003 after a series of structural problems that engineers couldn't explain, and it remained empty until the renovation project that uncovered the lead-lined box containing Bishop Kenrick's sealed documents. This mystery shows us that evil can wear the most trusted faces, that predators can hide behind the very institutions we depend on for protection and guidance. The 14 altar boys of St. Joseph's were betrayed not just by a monster in human form, but by a system that valued faith over skepticism and institutional reputation over the safety of children. Their story reminds us that true vigilance requires the courage to question authority when our protective instincts tell us something is wrong, even when that questioning challenges the foundations of our beliefs. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the entity that called itself Father O'Malley found new communities to prey upon? Or was it finally stopped by forces beyond human understanding? Have you ever encountered situations where trusted authority figures demanded unquestioning obedience that made you uncomfortable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories that reveal the dark secrets hidden in America's religious history, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that chill the soul. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another buried truth that powerful institutions hoped would never see the light of day.